If you create it as part of this outdoor room and you are seeing it every day, you can look out the window and you can see, the hummingbirds coming to the edible scarlet runner beans. And when you walk by it every day, you really, the chores become easier because you just do a little here and a little there, and it doesn't become so overwhelming.
Welcome to the Food Garden Life Show. We think that growing and cooking together builds families and builds communities.
Our goal is to inspire and inform with stories and ideas about gardening, food, and people, and we give gardeners permission and confidence to challenge the rules.
Brought to you by Emma and Stephen Biggs. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Hey everyone, I'm Emma Biggs, and thank you for hanging out with us today on the Food Garden Life Show. I'm a Gen Z gardener, author, speaker, and blogger, and my passion is growing tomatoes, trying new and unusual crops, and saving seeds. I'm also the author of the kids' gardening book, Gardening with Emma, and my co-host here on the show is my dad, Stephen.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Biggs, food gardening guy, horticulturist, author, and horticultural journalist. Today on the podcast, we head to Ohio to find out about Potager gardens. And our guest today writes, the Potager is more than a kitchen garden. It's a philosophy of living that is dependent on the seasons and the immediacy of the garden. When I read that, I had to know more. So I'm delighted that today we can chat with Jennifer Bartley. She's a landscape architect, author, speaker, and potager expert from Ohio. Jennifer's also the author of The Kitchen Gardener's Handbook and Designing the New Kitchen Garden, an American Potager Handbook. I have Designing the New Kitchen Garden and love it. It's out of print, but I suggest you track down a used copy. Jennifer will tell us about creating a sense of intimacy in a garden and how to think about seasonality. You can find Jennifer online at americanpotager.com. And if you don't know how to spell potager, it's Potager, so americanpotager.com. If you're serious about food gardening, you can get my twice-monthly newsletter on foodgardenlife.com, and when you sign up, you get 2 guides, 20 small-space food gardening hacks, and grow figs where you think you can't in cold climates.
Do you have show ideas, questions, or feedback?
We want to hear what you think. So tell us. If you drop by foodgardenlife.com, you can email us, or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we hang out under the handle Food Garden Life.
And you can also find me on Instagram as EmmaBiggs_grows, and you can also find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca.
A shout out to a few listeners today, and thanks to Claudette, who got in touch after seeing the picture I posted of myself cooking on TV. And shout outs to Scott, Greg, Jennifer, and Joyce for getting in touch. And a shout out to our listeners on Reality Radio 101 who are hanging out with us. This is year 4 of our live radio show on Reality Radio 101. It's on the first Wednesday of every month. Now the station is bringing you all of our weekly episodes. Do you like what you hear? Give us a shout out, either to the studio or to me directly at foodgardenlife.com. There's been such an explosion in interest in growing food over the last year. I've seen some great new gardens. I've also seen a few faltering plastic kit gardens from big box stores. So I decided to pull together edible gardening inspiration from my teaching, from my presentations, people I've interviewed, books I've written, articles, and put it all together into a new online course. It's called Edible Garden Makeover, and it's all about making an edible garden you love. I'd be honored if you want to know more about it. Be the first to find out when I put out more details by getting on my early bird list, which is at ediblegardenmakeover.com/early-bird. I've already been putting out videos with ideas from my course, and if you'd like to see those, Just find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook where I hang out as Food Garden Life. And a spoiler alert, the first video has an inspiring makeover of a 100-foot driveway into an edible garden oasis. Now, here is our chat with Jennifer Bartley of American Potager in Granville, Ohio.
Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, you're welcome. It's great to be here.
We're really excited about this episode because we've never had an episode about potagers, and maybe could we start out by finding out from you how you got into such a special topic?
First of all, let me define a little bit what I think of when I think of a potager. So potager is French for kitchen garden. So, and it literally means for the soup pot. So the French have always understood, this connection of what's growing in the garden being served at the table. So the jardin potager. So I originally got into this when I was doing my thesis work for a master's degree in landscape architecture at The Ohio State University. I wanted to study the walled edible garden, and I thought at first that would lead me to England, but it led me to France. So I studied some of these great walled edible kitchen gardens in France, and really that was the beginning of this whole adventure. Was really a thesis project.
And I'm curious to know what interested you in walled edible kitchen gardens in the first place?
So at the time in school, we were doing a lot of urban design work. And so I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and in Columbus, in the Midwest, you see, even in urban areas, you see these open spaces, which really are parking lots. I began to think, well, could some of these spaces be used? I mean, could you do something different? Could you create a garden? So that was the beginning of my interest in an urban area. And so that's really what I began to explore. How can we borrow these walls, these buildings, these, the wall, borrow that to create these enclosed gardens? Because what I saw really in France were the early monastery gardens, and which were just that, walled gardens with spaces, open spaces, and oftentimes, connecting walls and connecting spaces. So that's what I thought of, I guess, in the city.
Going from these old monastery gardens in France and coming back to Ohio, I'm really interested to know now what kind of clients are interested in having gardens inspired by these potagers. Who are you working with?
Really, I think before I even answer that, so the history in the United States, especially where I'm from in the Midwest, when we would think of a kitchen garden, we would think of creating a garden similar to what we could see around us, the cornfields, the soybean fields, things like that. So what we might do is we would go to the remotest part of our property and we would, create a little garden in rows. We would never go there. The hose wouldn't reach there. We'd walk out, it'd be overcome with weeds, and we'd think, well, I'd try again next year. So that was sort of the model of, what I was used to in the Midwest. So when I saw these gardens, especially, the French gardens, as I said, the gardens were part of the chateaus. It was connected within the wall. And so it was all within view of the house, all within view of the residents. And so that's what I wanted to adapt in modern times. So in other words, an application for that would be make it beautiful, put it in a place that is accessible, create some sort of wall if you can. It doesn't mean it's a 12-foot wall like we saw in France, but It could be a low wall. It could be a hedge. It could be a rose hedge. It could be a fence. Something that would create a special place. So to answer your question, there are lots of clients who want that. Lots of people who want a way to grow their own food, but they want to do it in a beautiful way, something that would look good, even if they end up, not growing food.
I'm really interested to think about that because it's true that so often we see the vegetable garden, it's at the back of the yard, and it consists of rows. So changing that over then to beautiful, accessible, and enclosed.
And, it's interesting because I think that is one of the biggest maintenance issues, really, for these gardens. As I said before, if you put it in a remote part of your landscape, you don't go there, you don't see it, and you don't maintain it. If you create it as part of this outdoor room and you are seeing it every day, you can look out the window and you can see, the hummingbirds coming to the edible scarlet runner beans. And when you walk by it every day, you really, the chores become easier because you just do a little here and a little there, and it doesn't become so overwhelming.
I think one of the main things that you mentioned before is that a potager garden should be beautiful. And so I'm curious to know what part flowers or ornamentals play in the garden, because it's called the garden of the soup pot. So is there a part for those in a potager garden?
The French always understood this connection of what was growing in the garden being served at the table. So historically, they had, their menus were seasonal and based on what was growing in the garden. And as you know, that changes throughout the season. So in the spring, you might have your onions and your chives and potatoes, things that you can, the soup becomes, an onion soup, a leek soup. And then as the seasons change, the summer, you're having, squashes and tomatoes, and maybe the soup is a cold soup. It's a gazpacho soup. And what I also love is that it's the flowers then that are changing too. So I love to be able to not just pick something to eat, but then the flowers too, you're not eating the flowers, but you're putting them in the vase right alongside the vegetables.
On your website, you'd talked about gardens being a joy to the soul and bounty for the table. So as you talked about the flowers, I was thinking about that.
Yes. And so historically, as I said, the connection of these, the early French gardens, the early French edible gardens were often monastery gardens. So you can imagine the monks who often lived their entire lives then, in the monastery behind the wall, growing their own food. And the Benedictine monks actually had a philosophy of living. And so they would spend a third of their day working in the garden, a third of the day on intellectual pursuits, and then a third of the day on spiritual prayer. So I kind of love that early idea of the kitchen garden. And then also the history of Islamic gardens was also similar in the sense that they were walled gardens, but they were paradise gardens. There was very much a sense that when you crossed into that garden, you were in paradise. It felt like paradise. It was an oasis. So that's another thing that I like to borrow then, the idea of the garden being an oasis, the kitchen garden, the potager being an oasis, and applying that to the modern garden for our homes, because we do need that, even more so, now. We need a place of restoration and refuge and, just getting away from it all, and how great it can be if it's right outside your back door.
So what is your approach to kitchen garden design so that you can make that oasis?
It's interesting. So in my books, I did all the photography and all the drawings in there, but I featured my garden in the books, which was a 4-square kitchen garden right outside the back door, ran the length of my house. We were able to reuse some brick from a building that was being torn down in Columbus, of course, to build a parking lot. But we, with permission, were able to get that used brick. And so my sons and I laid out this lovely, walkway, brick walkway with the traditional quadripartite 4 raised beds, and then surrounded it with flowers and shrubs. And it, of course, was a fenced garden with a gate on both ends, which I loved. And we got a lot of enjoyment and probably had that garden for 25 years. We sold that house 3 years ago, and I bought the house that I grew up in, the mid-century modern house overlooking the ravine. I do not have a kitchen garden right now, but to answer your question, how do I think of designing a kitchen garden? I'm in the process of thinking about how to create that for this mid-century modern house. So some of those ideas for creating that. One is, in my mind, it needs to be ideally a place that can be a destination in a sense, close to the kitchen if you can, but also creating it in a way that it feels like its own special place, like a special room. I don't know if that makes sense, but in the garden in the house that I have now, there is it's outside the back door. It's a small area, but I'm thinking of creating the kitchen garden there because it's surrounded. It has a wall of the garage and then another part of a wall. And I think that I can really create this really comfortable outdoor space where I grow food.
It can be intimate then with those walls that you're talking about. You're talking about a mid-century modern house, and with a potager often having such traditional style cues, how could you fit that in then with a mid-century modern? What would you do to adapt it?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's why I'm still kind of mulling it over. Now, I will say a square shape. I mean, raised beds work great. They're not a total requirement for the potager. In the early monastery gardens, there were raised beds. And I do want to mention, so the idea of a beautiful kitchen garden or a kitchen garden near your house is not a new idea. These gardens are as old as time. I mean, they go back to medieval times, Renaissance. So those gardens were enclosed gardens. The hortus conclusus, a garden enclosed. It's not a modern design idea to create a garden as if it's an outdoor room. These were outdoor, edible gardens, open to the sky, but with some sort of enclosure. What I was saying, the shape a rectangle shape is very convenient. I mean, you could create a potager, very free form, or, a grid is an easy system to work, I guess.
I was going to ask, and maybe this is a good segue into that, whether you have 2 or 3 top tips for people who are they're excited. They've heard about a potager, so we've got their creative juices flowing and they want to sit down and look at their yards. What are a couple tips you'd give them as they think about this idea of a potager?
So I've talked about, borrowing a wall, like the back of a garage or part of a building. That is one tip, but with the thought, you do need to grow tomatoes and peppers and things like that. You need 6 hours at least of full sun a day. So if that little space is on the north side of a tall building, that's probably not going to work for growing those kinds of vegetables. So when you walk around your house, look for places that have good light. Now, we can grow things in shadier conditions. A lot of the, cabbages and parsley and things like that, they will take some shade, but ideally you're going to need sun. Another thought too, when I think of the potager, something that I want to create near my house, I'm thinking of almost like a tasting garden. So I'm growing a little of this, I'm growing a little of that, a certain kind of herb, and I'm mixing it up a little. I'm not necessarily growing for a huge quantity. If I wanted to do that, if I was putting up tomatoes and doing all of that, maybe you do put that in the back reaches of your residence. But when I think of the potager, it's more like a tasting garden. So I'm trying to grow herbs and specialty things that I want for the garden. So there's really no, it's limitless in my mind, because I always think, well, okay, what are the seasonal shrubs? Okay, how can we use some of these shrubs as part of the wall to our outdoor room? My goal when I design for clients is that they will have something to pick to eat, or for a decoration. That could be a berry, that could be a grass frond, it could be a flower, it could be a beautiful colored stick or whatever. Anything that they can pick. My goal is for them to be able to do that throughout the year, even without a greenhouse.
And I noticed on your website where you have pictures of plants that give winter interest in the garden.
Yes. Another thing about, the potager, especially since it's going to be near the house, you will see it, others will see it. The idea is to plant things or use things so that the garden looks good even in the winter, even when you're not using it.
Well, Jennifer, I haven't actually seen many pictures of potager gardens, but I know you talked about it as it being a special place or a destination. So I'm curious, do they often have like a seating area where you can go and read a book, maybe like a bench or a place to have a cup of tea? Can that be part of a potager garden?
Absolutely. And that's something that, over the many years that I've been designing these gardens, that's something that early on, I kind of forgot to include, but you kind of need to. So not that you might have that much time to sit down and enjoy the garden, but because you might be working. But no, absolutely, it should include a place to sit. Often it's an opportunity for a fountain, so you can hear bubbling water, just like the early paradise garden.
Well, this is, I had jotted down something else from your website to ask you about. Now that you're talking about the fountain and the seating, I have to read this for our listeners. And you'd said, the potager is more than a kitchen garden. It's a philosophy of living that's dependent on the seasons and the immediacy of the garden. So as soon as you were talking about seating and fountains, I thought, oh, well, that all knits together beautifully.
So I keep talking about France, but again, the French really got it right. So when they created their chateaus, which means house fortress, so this is early Renaissance times,
mm-hmm.
The chateaus in France, the kitchen garden was right outside the chateau, and then the wall, then it was enclosed with a wall. So the owner could look out and from the residence and see the vegetables growing. Now, contrast that a little bit with England. So in England at the time, it was not popular to see the messy working kitchen garden. So they removed that working garden from the house, hid it behind walls, but also thickets, so that there was a complete separation then in England at the time from the kitchen garden to the residence. And I think really something was lost there. I joke about, the English cooking, but I can't do that anymore. But there is a lesson then for us. And that is to borrow from the French, borrow that idea, make it accessible, again, right outside the door, right outside the window.
So you mentioned that these potager gardens have been around a really, really long time. And I'm curious to know what other things have changed in that period.
Well, of course, some of those early gardens and the ones that I'm talking about in France, like the Chateau de Villandry, which, by the way, if any of your listeners, when we can travel again, Villandry is part of a whole area that is, a world class. It's protected now it's a UNESCO site now. So including Villandry, meaning it has such cultural value to the world that it needs to be protected. Villandry, of course, was built in the Renaissance times. It would have been made as an early French garden. And then the English garden idea took over in France. And so they would have destroyed that original French garden and built an English garden with a rolling lawn. And then in the 1900s, Villandry was purchased by a gentleman named Caravello, and I believe that the family still owns it. And he had a conversion to Catholicism and wanted to recreate a monastery garden. So it's kind of a crazy, he's recreating a medieval monastery garden in a French Renaissance chateau. But Villandry is well worth and really an inspiration for any kind of kitchen garden that anyone would be interested in creating, even though the scale is so big. So they laid out, now we're painting the landscape with vegetables and fruits, based on their color. So artichokes, cardoons, bluish gray, and chartreuse, lettuce. And we're painting the landscape really as an art project in a way, but these are the early kitchen gardens. I would say the difference between then and now certainly is scale. So these are huge scale gardens. They had, of course, people, many people to work in the garden. My application for creating it in my landscape, I don't have help. I never was able to even train my children. So when I think of creating a garden, I do want to think of making it, manageable, I guess.
Well, maybe that's a great way for us to wrap up too, because if we have people thinking about making these kitchen gardens and we'd started talking about tips, maybe we could finish off with a couple ideas on how to keep it manageable, because I think often everyone's working in a family and it's always a stress to make a garden. So how can we keep our potagers and our kitchen gardens manageable?
Well, as I said before, creating, an outdoor room and creating it in a place that you will walk by every day. So that is one thing, the placement. I would say if you're creating raised beds as part of that, make the raised beds in a dimension that is very usable. So something that a width is about 4 feet, just about the width that you can reach over and, weed or access the plants without ever having to step on the soil. So that could be 4 foot by 5 foot, or just at least one of the dimensions around 4 feet. So that's one tip. I would say the pathways between the raised beds make it wide enough, depending on how you want to use it, but maybe wide enough for a wheelbarrow. So maybe the width for that walkway is 3 feet. There is this romantic idea, then, as I have talked about, the potagers are where we're growing herbs and flowers and edible flowers and fruits and vegetables, and we're doing it all in a beautiful way. That's a very romantic idea. I would say one practical thing that I've learned is annual flowers go with annual vegetables. Perennial flowers go with perennial vegetables. So you might want to border with a zinnia or calendula or marigolds. Those are all annuals. So that fits in very well in the annual garden. Whereas in the perennial bed, you could have roses, but you could have, well, actually I also tuck in some onions, in some of the beds like that, but you would have asparagus or some of your more permanent perennial vegetables in with perennial flowers.
Well, Jennifer, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Before we wrap up, could you let our listeners know how they can learn more about what you're doing?
Okay, great. Yes, you can go to my website, which is americanpotager.com.
Jennifer, thanks so much for hanging out with us and talking about potagers and the origin of potagers. And I'm feeling inspired to look at my garden and reimagine some of the plant choices and how I have things laid out. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That was our chat with Jennifer Bartley of American Potager in Granville, Ohio. You can find her online at americanpotager.com. What did you think? I was struck by the idea of the garden as a place of restoration and refuge, somewhere that feels like it's its own special place. As Jennifer talked about gardens near the kitchen being much more visible, but also much more likely to get attention because we pass through them regularly, I thought of my back garden, which is never quite as tip-top as my gardens near the house. If this episode piqued your interest in kitchen gardens, tune in to our May 2020 episode where we chat with author Emily Murphy from California in the episode Grow a Food Garden You Love. As we wrap up today's episode, I'm thinking of walls and gardens, and I'm thinking of the Fortress of Louisbourg, the National Historic Site in Nova Scotia. It's a historical recreation of a French fort from the 1700s, certainly far different from the rural French chateau, but there are some very nice heritage gardens there, and being a fort, everything is enclosed. The podcast is back next Thursday, and next Thursday, Isaac Crosby from Toronto joins us to talk about he weaves the 7 grandfather teachings from his Ojibwe traditions into gardening.
You can listen to past episodes of the Food Garden Life podcast on foodgardenlife.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are found.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.